What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. We are over a year since the release of the Lord of the Rings Universes Beyond set that was straight to Modern and all the other kind of Eternal formats not named Pioneer. And needless to say, it's a pretty big success in terms of having cards that are more than playable in the format. Actually, a lot of them being kind of staples of the format, as some of them more in the short term, and then for the long term of its release. Things like Orcish Bowmaster, we are all very familiar with. Very powerful from the Yawgmoth decks to the Scam decks, what have you. Playing it fairly, unfairly, whatever the case may be, Orcish Bowmaster has been an integral part of the Modern format. We've seen cards like Flame of Anor and Lorien Revealed in like a lot of the blue decks, and like Lorien Revealed itself not just being a card that can land cycle but then end up drawing cards later, and like those super grindy matchups where you're basically top decking. And Delighted Halfling as a premier mana dork, just having 2 toughness, being able to survive things like Wrenn and 6, being able to dodge all like the 1 damage removal, forcing your opponent to have to put in a little bit more work, where they just can't Bowmaster / Wrenn and 6 / whatever, ping this mana dork down, while also giving the utility of being able to cast legendary spells with any color and then being able to make them uncounterable. But easily one of the most controversial cards from the Lord of the Rings set, and I don't think it's really that close, is the One Ring. And that's not just from a gameplay perspective. There's a lot of problems that come with this card outside of actually playing the games of Magic, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today, is kind of the problem that has been created with the One Ring, and basically everything that comes with it, and an important aspect being the fact that it is not an original thing to the Magic universe, but a whole new game piece that is going to be pretty hard to replicate. And I think there's a few ways that we can kind of go about trying to necessarily fix this problem and hopefully not be in a super weird situation, as we've kind of created a unique one here. But of course, before we get too deep in the video and we talk about the One Ring, the implications and everything like that, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where I post a lot about the Modern and Pioneer formats along with other longer form videos such as this. So if anything that interests you, again, please subscribe and ring notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And it is a free, easy way to support me and my content as we get ever closer to 1K. You guys are going to hear me talking about it until we actually get there. So if you want me to shut up about it already, just click subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have subscribed, again, thank you for all your support and everything. It does really mean a lot to me. It keeps me making these videos and all that fun stuff. So with all that said, let's go ahead and discuss the One Ring. So for those of you maybe not familiar with the One Ring, I have it on your screen here. It is a 4 mana legendary artifact that is indestructible. When the One Ring enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring, and you can tap it to put a burden counter on the One Ring, and then draw a card for each burden counter on the One Ring. Now that we know what the One Ring does, let's kind of give a little bit of a history lesson with the One Ring. When this card was previewed and spoiled, whatever you want to call it, people were very underwhelmed by it, and rightfully so, because at the time, one of the best 4-drops in the format was Omnath Locus of Creation, and it's a 4-mana spell that, even though it's very restrictive, being basically 1 of every color except for black, it did a lot for that 4 mana. It got to draw a card when it came into play. The 4/4 body was nice. It basically gave you free mana if you played a fetch land. It was going to gain you life, so it was going to be very hard for aggro decks to kind of beat you out of nowhere. Maybe nowadays it's a little easier with like Slick Shot show off, but nonetheless, like at the time, like Omnath was kind of the gold standard for a 4-drop. And even like Jace the Mind Sculptor at this point was like fringe playable at best in the Modern format, to kind of give you an idea of how good 4 converted mana cost cards were, and basically how good you had to be to see play in the format. So when the One Ring was spoiled, it was just kind of like, cool, this is going to be like a commander card that's going to be a lot of fun to play with. It's going to be very abused, and as we saw in like something like Legacy, where we've seen people like, and even in Vintage too, play the One Ring, tap to draw a card, and then you untap, and then you draw 2 cards, and then you untap and draw 3 cards, whatever, and then you have taken 3 damage, but in theory you've drawn 6 cards, where normally the rate where it's like super busted is 1 card for 1 life, and you essentially got 2 cards for 1 life. Absolutely insane rate, and of course it just kind of ramps up from there. So the One Ring definitely showing, at least in like the older formats, that it was very powerful, and of course we have, you know, hindsight to look on it, that we were all pretty dumb for thinking that the One Ring was, you know, a fringe playable, a modern card at best. And so kind of like breaking it down and everything, the big burden, I guess, the thing that made the One Ring kind of a downside for drawing all these cards is the fact that you had burden counters on it, and that you would lose life with burden counters on it. So if you weren't able to end the game and you wanted to draw a bunch of cards with the One Ring, you're going to take progressively more and more damage, and essentially you were going to take more and more, you were going to take the damage later. You know, you got to draw the cards now, you got to figure out something to do with the One Ring. Some of the best options were bouncing it with like a Teferi Time Raveler, or just simply playing another One Ring and resetting the counters that way, and then also getting protection again in a lot of the cases. So like from there, you know, the One Ring, like the downside really wasn't a downside, simply for the fact that there were plenty of other ways in the format where you could just get rid of this, or end up abusing it, where you just get to draw a bunch of cards and you weren't really intending on paying it back later because you just ended up playing another ring. And that's kind of where the issues start to kind of come about with the One Ring. I'll be honest, like all the things that should in theory be downsides for the One Ring are just major upsides for the person playing it. For one, it's indestructible. Now, yes, if you're the person playing the One Ring, you could play like Shatter effects in your deck, and they would also be like decent against some of the other decks in the modern format right now. So having like a free way of just like, okay, I can blow up my own ring if I need to, or I can blow up opposing rings, whatever, great. The fact that this is indestructible means that your opponent can't do the same thing, and if, you know, we all recall, Boseiju is essentially a staple of any deck that is playing green to kind of deal with non-basic lands, enchantments, artifacts, what have you. So the fact that Boseiju can't even hit the One Ring means that your opponent gets to kind of keep their ring going, while also getting to play cards that are individually powerful on their own that just happen to reset the ring in some way via like something like a Teferi Time Raveler, where, you know, making your opponent play it at sorcery speed, and then you're going to end up bouncing your ring and you're going to draw a card in a format now where we have like Force of Negation and Flare Denial and whatnot, and these free counter spells, you know, Subtlety and whatnot, just makes it even that much harder to then like try to interact with your opponent while they end up, you know, again, resetting their ring and kind of get things going again from there, drawing a bunch of cards and basically just trying to find a way to close the game at that point, because the game is over. Your opponent draws like 15, 20 cards with the ring and they've only taken like 6 damage from it. Over. We're done here. Like you have to be very lucky as an opponent and very unlucky as a person playing the ring to either not find other copies of the ring to then legend rule your ring, and then you've just drawn so many cards, so now you're taking a bunch of damage from your burden counters, or just hope that your opponent really isn't able to keep drawing with the ring and you're forcing them to play their other copies to get protection from everything so that they just don't die to like your board and whatnot. And again, in a lot of cases, like the decks playing like the One Ring are also playing cards like Supreme Verdict to kind of stop you from getting to deal with your opponent, or, you know, to stop you from being able to attack your opponent effectively and actually end the game. And the person playing the One Ring doesn't even necessarily need to end the game. They just need to, you know, get so far ahead on cards and X for 1 you to death until, you know, you essentially have nothing left. You're not really top decking anything, and there are other just kind of like game pieces that again can kind of help manage the ring, but then also are very powerful on their own, can find ways to end the game as well. So some of you are thinking, well, Dakota, no big deal. You know, if the experience is miserable if you're not playing the ring, and it's a lot of fun when you are playing it, I'm just going to put 4 rings in my deck, and then I get to kind of be in on the fun or the experience of kind of winning games that, you know, just snowball out of control because of the One Ring. And I implore you to do so. I just hope that, you know, you can afford the 4 cheapest copies, which will total to almost $400, meaning that you're going to spend probably at least like $90+ per copy of the One Ring you're playing, and you're probably going to need at least 4 of them, because there's very few decks that are going to be legal going forward that play only 2 copies of the One Ring, or really less than 4 copies of the One Ring. So that brings up a good question: how do we lower the price of the One Ring? Well, I think reprinting it straight up is just completely out of the question. I mean, the One Ring is very important to the Lord of the Rings lore, and of course, Magic does not own the One Ring or anything like that. So I think using its likeness and name is probably just completely like thrown out the window. Same with like a lot of these other cards in the set. I think Bowmasters might be able to kind of get around it because you could technically, I think, have an Orcish Bowmaster in Magic's like history, or whatever the case may be of that. You could probably reprint that card. The One Ring in specific, you're not going to be able to reprint by name, and I don't think you're going to be able to have the name included anywhere. So doing it as like naming it something else, but then having that little type line at the bottom that says like the One Ring on it is probably out of the question. So you're thinking, well, let's just reprint a card that essentially reads like the One Ring, but it's just named completely different. Which brings up kind of another host of problems, like people that already own 4 copies of the One Ring now have access to 4 more copies of a One Ring-like card, which, we can argue if a deck should be playing more than 4 copies of it, whatnot. But again, just the fact that it gives the option to those players that already own the One Ring to then play more copies of it, and again, kind of incentivizes you that if there's a deck that essentially plays 5 or 6 copies of the One Ring main deck, or whatever configuration ends up being correct, just kind of makes it harder, because now older copies, like the actual One Ring, ends up costing a lot of money, and then even if the other one's cheap, you still need to go buy copies of the One Ring if deck lists are playing 5, 6, 7, 8 copies of this new card. Since reprinting the One Ring is out of the question, whether in name or just a card that's functionally the same as the One Ring, I think one of the best ways to kind of help the problem with the One Ring is making it restricted in whatever formats that it's legal in, so that essentially you're stuck playing 1 copy of the ring no matter what. And it makes it kind of a more important game piece to try to manage, rather than just hoping that you draw enough cards that you end up finding another ring and you're actually kind of forced to build around it, even if, again, some of the cards that you would already put in your deck to kind of help with the One Ring would already then make the deck. It just makes it a little bit more of an important thing to kind of play around, other than just having that extra layer of like, well, if I find another one, then I'm going to be able to manipulate this sort of thing and draw a ton of cards, and then, well, I reestablish protection and whatnot. And while I know that there's other cards out there, like Phyrexian Metamorph being a big one that you can cast and it ends up copying a ring, and then, it gets to do the ring protection thing and then becomes a copy of the ring, I think cards like that end up actually coming at like a cost. So I think that kind of goes back to, you're not just hoping to draw necessarily another copy of the ring to kind of reset it and everything. You're having to play cards in your deck that kind of serve that purpose of doing it, and then if they have another purpose outside of it, that is going to be kind of a bonus. And I think that's a little bit more of an interesting kind of build to play in Modern, is doing that rather than banning it outright or printing it in some other way, whether it's some form of restricted reprint, which again would not help necessarily the price of the card, or a functional reprint, which also wouldn't help the price of the original ring, because then those players would have access to way more copies than some of the other players that maybe didn't play Lord of the Rings at the time of its release. Now, while restricting will probably definitely help in like the gameplay department, because again, it's not circling around drawing multiple copies of the One Ring and you're having to play other cards to help kind of circumvent the damage that you could potentially take from the One Ring, resetting the protection, etc. The only way that would really help out the price is if that players that were holding on to copies of the ring had a play set or more, ended up selling those copies online to try to get out of them. And while I think in theory, yeah, if no player wanted to have more than 1 copy of the One Ring, well, then yeah, you would just sell it and get rid of it, because you would have no reason to own multiple copies of it. But again, still being in short supply and none essentially being added to the pool that's already out there, just means that there's really no incentive to then sell those rings, and people will actually pay even more of a price, because instead of paying, maybe $90 for the version that you're seeing in front of your screen right now, it could be $150, because that, hey, you are only going to buy 1 copy of this ring, you're going to end up paying for that ring. And while it would necessarily be cheaper than a play set of the One Ring, it still kind of feels bad having to spend $150 on 1 card. when, you know, there are other cards that you need to put in your deck that are also pretty expensive, and just kind of maybe doesn't necessarily drive up the total cost of a deck, but definitely feels worse, you know, not buying a playset of a card for $150, but buying one card that you absolutely need for $150. So in conclusion, what should happen to the One Ring? And I don't think that there's a very good thing to do with the One Ring. You could just outright ban it, but it's kind of a pillar of the format at this point. Like, do we really need to ban it? Again, it's a card that doesn't win the game on its own necessarily. Like, in a direct term, it doesn't win the game on its own, but it does kind of create these snowball scenarios where, yeah, my opponent is eventually going to play another ring. They're going to reset their protection. They're going to end up, more importantly, getting a new ring that doesn't have any burden counters on it, and they just got to draw 4, 5, 6 cards without necessarily taking damage for drawing those cards. And again, just kind of bearing your opponent in that card advantage to where they're going to need to be very lucky and you're going to need to be very unlucky as the person playing the ring to not win the game, kind of from that scenario. I mean, it is technically possible, but I would say very unlikely, and I will take the side of the ring player all day, every day. If you restrict it, you don't really solve the cash problem of having to get the cards, because sure, maybe there'll be some people that sell off their rings, but you know, unless everybody who owns multiple copies of the rings decide that they're going to sell their copies and people try to undercut each other, you could potentially see copies of the One Ring fetch an even higher price tag. Even though you'll be spending less money overall, not having to get a playset and only being able to get one, you're still spending more money than you would have if you just bought a One Ring right now. Honestly, it's an unenviable position to be in, because if you just make a functional reprint of this card, then the game kind of gets a little bit worse from there, because you have just even the potential to play up to 8 rings in your deck, or, you know, that type of effect, which we know is very bad already at 4 copies. Imagine being able to play a 5th or a 6th one. You are very likely to find multiple copies of rings and kind of keep chaining them together while drawing tons and tons of cards. If you restrict it, you're not going to do anything about the price of the card, but you're going to end up, you know, in a way kind of fixing kind of the play pattern, or at least making it play out a lot differently from a format that has 4 copies of the ring legal. And if you ban it altogether, you know, I think the One Ring has become kind of a staple, or like a feature of the modern format at this point, that it would feel pretty bad to ban it, especially being kind of the premier card from the Universes Beyond set that you're now trying to emulate going forward in 2025 and beyond. That, you know, you just have these powerful cards that you printed, but then you're going to be willing to kind of ban them, even though they're very iconic, not only in their own kind of in their own franchise, but now iconic kind of in Magic's history. So it'll be interesting to see if anything gets done about the One Ring. But if, as long as things stay the same the way that they are, you know, we're going to see decks more than likely playing 4 copies of the One Ring, it continuing to be kind of a feel bad from a game perspective, and very, very expensive and almost unattainable for a lot of the other players that play the game of Magic. And it's a little unfortunate, but, you know, Wizards has kind of put themselves in this position, and, you know, who knows if we'll actually see cards, maybe not necessarily exactly like the One Ring, but cards that are very important or reference important things in other franchises going forward that are going to be kind of pushed cards that are going to be format staples, and how they kind of react to those cards going forward. So that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you liked the video, please leave a like on it. Comment down below what you think should happen to the One Ring. Do you think it should get banned, restricted, find a way to reprint it, what have you? You know, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I would love to hear what you think. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, so you know when future videos get posted, as we do kind of these longer form videos, along with a lot of content based on the Modern and Pioneer format. But that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.